Hello everyone. I will share real stories that I know and I'm sure you will like them.
The kitchen was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The evening air was warm, heavy with the scent of freshly brewed tea and something faintly sweet lingering from earlier. I stood on my toes, stretching my arm upward, fingers grazing the edge of the top shelf where I had pushed the jar of honey a few days ago. Too far. I sighed, shifting my stance, pressing my free hand against the counter for balance. My husband usually got things down for me, but he wasn't home yet, and I hated having to drag the step stool out every time. The stretch sent a slow pull through my back, the soft fabric of my dress lifting just slightly as I reached again, determined to grab the jar without making a production out of it. Then, out of nowhere, hands, firm, steady, warm. They settled on my waist, gripping just enough to steady me. My breath caught, fingers freezing mid-reach as a low voice came from just behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath near my shoulder. Careful, my stepson. The realization hit at the same time my pulse did quickening, uncertain. His hands didn't move right away, staying there just a moment longer than they should have, firm but not forceful, as if he were waiting for me to react first. My skin tingled under his touch, heat spreading through me despite the cool air slipping through the open window above the sink. I started, but my voice caught, coming out softer than I intended. His fingers flexed slightly, a barely there motion that sent a slow, unexpected shiver down my spine. "You okay?" I nodded quickly, but I didn't move. Neither did he. The space between us was thin now, almost non-existent, the air suddenly charged with something I didn't quite know how to name. I should have stepped away. I should have laughed, made a joke, brushed it off like nothing. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow, waiting to see if he would be the first to move. And he wasn't. The weight of his hands lingered, grounding yet uncertain. His fingers curled slightly, testing, as if he was debating whether to let go or hold on just a moment longer. The warmth of his body was closer now, not touching, but near enough that I could feel it. "I just didn't want you to fall," he murmured, voice quieter than before, almost hesitant. I swallowed, forcing a small nod. "Thanks." Still, neither of us moved. The light from the window cast a soft glow over the countertops, shadows stretching along the floor, flickering as the wind outside stirred the curtains. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly felt louder, the world outside reduced to background noise while something unspoken settled between us. His hands finally slid away, slow and deliberate, his fingertips trailing for just a second longer than necessary. The absence of his touch sent a strange, unwanted chill through me. But instead of stepping back, he lingered, his breath still close, the heat of his presence refusing to fade. "You always try to reach for things on your own?" His voice was softer this time, edged with something I couldn't quite place. I let out a breathy laugh, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "I don't like asking for help." He hummed, as if considering that, then leaned just a fraction closer. "You don't have to, you know." The words settled between us, heavier than they should have been. My fingers curled against the counter, a quiet tension stretching between us like a wire pulled too tight. I could still feel the heat where his hands had been, the ghost of his touch lingering on my waist. "I know," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Another pause, stretched and waited. His gaze flickered downward, just for a second, quick and fleeting, but enough to make my stomach tighten. Enough to make my breath hitch. And then, finally, he stepped back. The air between us shifted, but it didn't break. He cleared his throat, running a hand through his hair, exhaling as if trying to compose himself. "Be careful next time." I nodded, though the tension between us didn't ease, not really. "Yeah, I will." He hesitated for just a second longer before finally turning, walking toward the doorway. The space he left behind felt colder, emptier. My pulse still hadn't settled as I watched him disappear down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the kitchen. I exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to my chest, my skin still warm, still tingling. Nothing had happened. And yet, I wasn't sure if I wanted to forget that moment. Because some part of me knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but my thoughts remained tangled in that moment in the kitchen. The lingering warmth of his hands, the way his voice had lowered just slightly, as if testing the air between us. It had been nothing. And yet, it hadn't. I moved through my usual routine, trying to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like the warmth of the summer air outside, persistent, impossible to ignore. Even as I settled onto the couch with a book in my lap, my fingers rested idly on the pages, my mind somewhere else entirely. I didn't hear him approach. Still awake. His voice was quieter now, less teasing than before, but no less aware. I looked up to find him leaning in the doorway, hands tucked into his pockets, posture relaxed in a way that made my pulse quicken despite myself. Yeah, I murmured, shutting the book though I hadn't really been reading it. Couldn't sleep. He nodded, stepping inside just far enough to blur the boundaries of the room. Me neither. The air shifted again. A quiet, invisible pull between us. I should have said something. Should have made some excuse to break whatever this was before it could settle too deeply into the space between us. But instead, I sat there, my fingers resting lightly against the cover of my book, my breath too shallow, waiting. He took another step forward. Earlier. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. My throat tightened. You didn't. His gaze flickered over me, searching, as if measuring the truth in my words. Okay, but he didn't move away. A heavy silence settled, stretching between us like a thread pulled too tight. I knew I should get up, should say something casual, something that would shift us back into the safe, comfortable roles we had always occupied. And yet, I stayed frozen, waiting to see what he would do next. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I should probably go. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what I would have said, even if I had tried. He turned, making his way toward the hallway, and for a moment, I thought that was it, that whatever had flickered between us would dissolve as easily as it had appeared. But then, just before he disappeared into the shadows, he paused, glanced back, and in that brief second, something passed between us, unspoken, unanswered. Then he was gone. I let out a slow, unsteady breath, pressing my fingers against the book in my lap, feeling the imprint of the moment still lingering on my skin. Nothing had happened. And yet, everything had changed. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end.